After we finished eating, I tipped Carol well for the professional service and for the rare smile she had given me. We stepped outside. The air was crisp and punctuated with the smell of exhaust from the cab I had hailed. I held the door open for Amy, and she gave me a sarcastic smile as she stepped into the car. "You know," I said after I'd gotten in and given the driver our destination, "my father taught me always to open the door for a lady." "Well, I'm no lady," she said, fiddling with the lock on the door. "Tonight you are, so get used to some gentlemanly treatment." She scoffed and shot me a sharp look. "Just roll with it," I said. When we arrived, she began watching the people climbing the steps to War Memorial Opera House, an American Renaissance architectural wonder, while I paid the cabbie. "Wow, I've never seen this at night," she said, a little dazed as we stepped out of the cab. "You like it?" I asked. "It's all right," she shrugged. She was getting more used to the heels and was walking with a little more grace toward the steps. I offered my arm, and she laughed, backing away. "Well, go on, take my arm. Let's do this right." Suspiciously, she took my arm as we climbed the steps. "This was built in 1932 to honor the fallen soldiers of World War I, the Great War." "What's so great about it?" "The building or the war," I said sincerely. She scoffed. "Pfft, just making a joke. Do continue the tour, Mr. Tour Guide." This was not opening night, so not everyone was dressed up, but there were some extravagant dresses among the gathering crowd in the expansive lobby. No white gloves or tuxedos, but some were dressed to impress. There was nothing all that impressive about us, but at least we weren't wearing jeans and hoodies like some of the younger crowd. "Wow," she said as she left my arm. "Glad we dressed up. There's some fancy shit going on in here." "Fancy shit indeed," I said, hoping to sound funny but dignified. I took a moment to inhale. This was sacred ground, and even though I'd seen La Boheme at least a dozen times, I received a thrill when the lobby chime went off to usher us to our seats. Although Laura had never performed here, I knew that she was waiting for me in the soprano's first aria. As we entered the hall, which was grand in gold and marble with red plush seating, Amy began to giggle. "Why are you laughing?" I asked. "I've just never seen anything quite like this. It's like we're stepping back in time, lords and ladies and shit." We took our seats at the front of the first balcony. When the lights lowered and the announcer stepped out, she whispered, "Is this in a foreign language?" "Yes, Italian. But look at the top of the stage. The words will be shown up there on the screen. You'll be fine." The announcer thanked us for coming and mentioned upcoming shows and sponsors, and finally, with no small amount of flair, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, San Francisco Opera's 2007 production of La Boheme." After a brief pause, the spotlight found the conductor walking to the podium, a spry man in his 60s with neatly trimmed white hair and mustache. He held up his hands as the audience clapped and made a quick bow. "I thought they all had to have crazy hair," she whispered as the crowd gave him a warm welcome. "They generally do," I smiled. "Now shush. You shush, fucker." The elderly woman beside me turned her head just enough to let her know that she would not tolerate much more. Then the orchestra leaped to life, and the curtains raised to reveal a charming apartment scene. The opera had begun. When the first voice reached us, I expected Amy to laugh or something, but when I turned to her, she was focusing on the man, unblinkingly. At the first humorous line, she laughed and whispered, "I didn't know this would be funny." And when Rodolfo stepped on Mimi's dropped key with his foot to keep her from leaving his apartment, she whispered, "Dude's a playa." By the time the tenor began his first aria, I'd forgotten about everything. Amy, deadlines, and apartments. I was in another world, Laura's world, and I was in 19th century Paris with starving artists and lovemaking. I reveled. At the first cues for Mimi's first act aria, my heart began to sink into a world of sadness and beauty as she sang of her simple life. Laura had once said that she sang all of her love songs for me, but that when she sang this aria, It was for her alone. It was an excellent first half. The tenor was a little pinched on top, but the soprano had a full and buoyant voice that carried every scene. When the house lights came up, I stood up to stretch, but Amy remained seated. "Is that it?" she asked softly. "Is that what?" "Is that the end of the opera?" "No, this is the intermission. There are 2 more acts." She sighed, visibly relieved. "Good, that's not enough. There needs to be more." "Come on, I'll buy you a ginger ale." As she sipped her ginger ale and I sipped my double bullet highball, we talked over the performance. Every word of hers was a small joy to me. She couldn't say enough. I couldn't get enough of her enthusiasm. I felt so reassured that bringing her here was a good idea. She spoke of the set, the costumes, the voices, the orchestra, every little detail of how the show went up to then. "Hey," she said with a serious tone as she put her empty glass on a table. "Thanks." I nodded and smiled deeply in my heart. "You know," I intimated, "this is the first time I ever took someone to the opera with me." I'd seen Laura perform many times, but never with a friend. She suppressed a smile and looked down. The chimes ding-donged, and it was time to return to our seats. The final 2 acts were not humorous like the first 2. They introduced the tragedy of Mimi's illness and her breakup with Rodolfo. Once again, as I'd seen many times, Mimi couldn't bear for Rodolfo to see her die, and as Mimi sang her last dying note in the squalid apartment, and Rodolfo cried out, I could feel warmth and trembling next to me. I turned to find Amy in tears, her face and ears red. I pulled out my linen handkerchief and gave it to her. She gave me a cross look, perhaps meaning to say, "Really? You carry one of these?" And she dabbed her eyes and nose. She was quiet the entire journey back to the apartment. "Didn't you enjoy the show?" I asked as I closed the door. She stood in the middle of the living room and confronted me. "You didn't tell me she was going to die." "No, I didn't want to spoil it for you. But didn't you kind of see it coming?" "No, I just thought she needed a cough drop or something. Anyway, I hated it." "What? You seemed to really like it at the intermission." "I hated it, okay?" And she stormed back to her room and slammed the door, fresh tears in her eyes.